Kevin Knuth. Thank you so much for taking your time today. I really appreciate you taking your time talking to me today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Um, to start things off, you prefer to use the term UFO rather than non-human intelligence or UAP or whatever other terms that are out
Yeah,
there.
some of these things are clearly objects. We've seen lasers bounced off of them, and they land and make landing marks. And these are the things I'm interested in. I'm interested in the objects, so I prefer the term UFO.
All right.
I know
And
that it's highly stigmatized, but I think that at some point people need to get used to the idea that they're real and and become accustomed to that.
yeah, what evidence would you point to for a lot of skeptical people out there that still claim that there is no hard proof, um, independently verifiable? What hard evidence would you point people to that are skeptical?
Well, this is where it gets difficult because there's no, as Michio Kaku would call it, no smoking gun. There's no obvious, oh, yeah, that's clearly an alien spacecraft. I mean, we don't know that they're alien. We don't know that they're piloted. But some of these things are clearly craft and they're clearly real. They're witnessed by thousands of people. Hundreds of accounts from military pilots. These are well trained individuals who are trained to be able to identify aircraft. I mean, that's their lives depend on it. Our nation's security depends on it, and they know when they're not looking at an airplane or a seagull. This becomes kind of silly at some point, be arguing that some of these things are seagulls. Yeah, and like I said, there is no single case, but if what typically happens is once if you're interested in the topic, you start studying it and you realize how much information there is, how much little pieces of information there is. And as a scientist, that's what you deal with all the time. You never have smoking gun evidence or something. We've never had a probe fly by a planet around another star, but I can tell you what these planets are like, to some degree. And this is from planets, from just watching the light coming from the stars. The Kepler Space Telescope just monitored a small patch of sky about the size of your palm, outstretched, in the constellations Lyra. And we found thousands of planets there, and we found that by watching the starlight, and you watch, and periodically there'll be little dips in the starlight. And from the nature of those dips, you can estimate the orbital parameters of the planet and the size of the planet, and in some cases, even the temperatures. So we're always working with little pieces of data as scientists. We rarely have smoking gun evidence of anything. How many of you have ever seen an atom? Seriously. The evidence we have that there are atoms is they're little pieces of evidence, and it's the mass of evidence, mass of all of these little pieces of evidence that gives you some kind of predictive power is what leads it to being a theory. And I think that's it's the same situation here.
How would you define UFOs and related phenomena?
Oh, again, that's hard to define. A UFO is an unidentified flying object, and so it doesn't imply that it's an alien spacecraft or anything. It's just unidentified. Some of these unidentified objects are very strange, and some of them appear to be craft with some strange properties or exhibit some rather shocking capabilities. High speeds, high accelerations, extremely luminous, and strong magnetic fields, strong electric fields. These are all features of some of these objects. I think the best way to define it at this point is probably to use the 5 characteristics that the ATIP program had come up with when they were studying UFOs. So you have, and I probably won't remember all five, right? So these things can fly without any obvious flight surfaces. They exhibit extremely high accelerations and speeds without signatures. So there's no sonic booms, there's no fireball. Um, they are hard to detect. They are hard to photograph. They seem to cloak or become blurry, and this is another feature of their behavior. And and then there's two more. But these are, and there's this the transmedium travel. They can go from air to water, water to air, effortlessly, and very possibly, we do have some evidence that they can go from space to air to water, and vice versa. So these are these properties are the properties that you would, probably best use to define what we're talking about when we're talking about UAP or UFOs.
Yeah. Can our current scientific framework fully explain UFOs?
No, and that's part of the problem, and that's part of what makes their anomalous nature difficult for some people to believe, because it's hard to imagine how these things are behaving. How you can go from air to water and water to air without changing your speeds. The video from the Homeland Security video from Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, shows an object, football shaped object about this big, maybe a little larger, flying at about 100 miles an hour, and it enters the water without a splash and barely slows down. I think slows down to about 85 miles an hour. And in fact, at some points underwater, actually speeds up and then comes out of water again and goes back in and comes back out with almost no impact to the water surface at all. So that by itself is hard to explain. The luminosities of these objects can be quite high. They've been calculated and estimated to be up to megawatts of power. What you need a megawatt light on your craft for is beyond me. I don't know why anything would need the light so bright. If one hypothesis is it's a byproduct of their propulsion system, but then you've got a propulsion system that's emitting waste light at a power of 100 megawatts. So what kind of powers are they dealing with? And we have estimates of that. Some of the maneuvers that these things have been seen to make would require 1,000 gigawatts of power in some cases, which is mind-boggling. You imagine you're dealing with power, an energy system that's working with 1,000 watts of power. I'm sorry, 1,000 gigawatts of power. It's a terawatt of power. If you have a 1% inefficiency in your system, that's 10 gigawatts of power being wasted to heat, which would melt your craft. So it's hard to imagine what's going on here. We're either wrong about the data that's coming in, which there is now a good bit of it, and it's all consistent. So this is hard to imagine that we're that wrong about that. But then it's hard to imagine that they are dealing with power systems that have less than 1% inefficiencies. That's hard to imagine. And it's hard to imagine that they're dealing with powers on the order of gigawatts to begin with, much less thousands of gigawatts. So
Yeah.
these things are really anomalous in many ways, and that's what makes them so shocking yet interesting.
Yeah. What is the limiting factor in our understanding of UFOs, and what advancements might change that?
I don't think it's clear yet what our limiting factor is in our understanding. I think we would first need to understand how, what physical principles they're using to operate. Um, One assumption, first assumption typically is that there are laws of physics that we don't know about. And that while that's possible, it's also important not to forget that the whole point of engineering is to use physics to find workarounds to problems, clever solutions, right? And we do this all the time with engineering. And in fact, the first estimates of the amount of energy it would take to send a rocket to the moon made it seem impossible. The conclusions were this won't work, this will never work, we can't ever leave the planet, it won't happen. But then they come up with the idea of staging. Well, let's lift it up in stages and then we'll drop the stages off. Well, that saves you a lot of energy. And it goes a long way to making it possible. So clever engineering can make things work that seem impossible. And I suspect that's in my opinion, that's probably what we're seeing here. But then, we still would have to identify the physics that are being utilized here to perform these workarounds. So one hypothesis is because the accelerations of these things that have been measured, the cases I've looked at, I've measured estimated accelerations up to about 5,000 Gs, 5,000 times the acceleration of gravity. The Japanese airline case from 1986 with the large walnut-shaped craft that was 3 747s in length. The radar data from that shows that that thing was accelerating at times up to 10,000 Gs of acceleration. Now, that's hard to imagine. It's incredibly hard to imagine. People can't really endure much more than 10 Gs. Our equipment can't handle much more than 15 Gs. At 13 and a half Gs, an F-35's wings will rip off. So we don't even know how to make machines that can handle more than 10, 15, 20 Gs. So, excuse me. So they have to be doing something. You're almost left with one possibility, and that is that they're somehow playing with inertia or gravity. They're, of course, closely related. And one might imagine that we could get there by looking at general relativity and some of the ideas about warp drives that have been proposed. So that might be one way to see a path toward how these things are operating. The obvious place where we know that we're missing physics is quantum gravity. We don't have a quantum theory of gravity, and we do know that a quantum theory of electrodynamics makes a huge difference in what you can do with electric and magnetic fields. So quantum electrodynamics is what allows us to make things like cell phones. And some of those technologies wouldn't have worked if you just used classical theories of electromagnetism like Maxwell's equations. Those aren't enough. And so a quantum theory gives you more control over these phenomena at the microscopic scale. And because we know we don't have a quantum theory of gravity, it's not clear what one could do with gravity if you could control it precisely. And I think that's probably where the big gap in our knowledge is. That's the obvious gap.
What do you find most difficult to digest or reconcile regarding UFOs?
Wow, I think that what's most difficult to digest is the topic that no one wants to talk about. And that is that there is very often, when people encounter these objects, they also report all sorts of paranormal like effects that happen during the encounter and afterwards. That's very common, thousands of reports. And so it's hard to believe that those reports are totally wrong, but it's hard to imagine what's actually going on. And I think that's probably one of the biggest mysteries about this. But it's so weird, and it's so it's you're basically combining multiple stigmatized topics, and so no one wants to touch it or even address it. And I think that's why many of us who are studying UAPs are focused on what we call the nuts and bolts, which are, let's just try to figure out how these craft fly first, and then worry about everything else later. And I think that's the most difficult area.
Yeah. Uh, Definitely can imagine that there are quite many theories out there, ranging from extraterrestrial, future human, interdimensional, holographic, projection theories. In your opinion, if you had to guess, what do you think best accounts for the UAP UFO sightings that we encounter?
That's again difficult because I don't think we have enough information to make that decision. There is there is evidence suggesting that whoever they are, they're from here. They live here, very possibly in our oceans. There's a great deal of evidence for that. Um, from the reports of encounters, there is some evidence that they might be human, but don't exactly look human. So, or sometimes look too human. It's very mixed and again very strange. So, I don't think we can really say anything about who they are yet. The time traveler option was one of them. I was not a big fan of that because now you're throwing time travel into the whole mix, which is a whole other difficult topic in physics. So I was not a big fan of the time travel option. But I noted that a lot of people, they're always time travelers from the future. Well, what if they're time travelers from the past? We've got so many options that we really don't. It's really too early to decide.
What kind of evidence do you mean when you say they could be from here, meaning Earth, or they could be human? Any specific cases or studies that you could point to?
A little bit. I can talk for the evidence that they're quite possibly from here. I'll go back to Carl Sagan. One of his arguments against UFOs being extraterrestrial was that he noted that it was hard for him to imagine that you'd have an interstellar craft arriving at Earth every other week. And he's absolutely right. I mean, that would be really hard to imagine. Um, but I think that the next logical thought is that you don't have an interstellar craft arriving here every other week. And the reason is because they're basically in the solar system already and very probably on the planet Earth because Earth is probably the best place for another organism to be in the solar system. So that would be one argument for the fact that they live here. The other is that um, their reaction time to events is too fast. The Russians used to perform military maneuvers, especially with naval ships, and they would do that to attract UFOs. And within 24 hours of their maneuvers, UFOs would show up. So the Russians used that to try to study UFOs. And we see that in the Fukushima nuclear power plant disaster when the tsunami hit. It was the next day that you had UFOs seen in the area, and that's very common. So if they can get here in 24 hours, you can reason very probably that they are not coming from more than half of a light day away. So it takes light a half of a day to travel out to where they are. Then they can travel at the speed of light back, and they'll get to Earth one day later. So they're probably not further than that. It's probably closer, and the obvious places here on Earth. And also because of so many sightings of these things going into the oceans. These things clearly have a relationship to water, and it's very possibly that they are somehow living underwater or have a presence there at least.
What do you think we would find if we would research the oceans more closely? Any
I have
speculations?
no idea what we'd find. Yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in that. I would love to know what the situation actually is. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities. There could be simple research bases, or just bases of any kind, small facilities. You could actually have places where there were cities. I mean, you could have a city the size of New York City down somewhere in a deep Pacific, and we would never know it. So we have no idea.
Do you have any guess to why they are attracted to nuclear facilities?
That's a very good question, and I don't. And again, there's not a definitive answer. There is a lot of opinions and a lot of guesses. I would reason that we have some evidence that they probably live here. They clearly have an interest in Earth, whatever that interest is, we don't know. If they evolved here, they live here like we do. If they're future humans or past humans or past whatever that lived here, they all again still have an interest in Earth. If they're extraterrestrial and discovered Earth some time ago, they could very well consider Earth to be their planet. They found it, and so if you have, so the possibility is that we are sharing this planet with others who we have know nothing about, and they have a vested interest in this planet. And since the last century, humans have advanced to the point where we are capable of destroying the planet. And we know this. We have worried about this ourselves, right? We could destroy the whole planet, and if they have an interest in this planet, then they would be wise to know what our capabilities are. And so that would mean that you would have to study our nuclear capabilities. And so, at the very least, they could be studying them. We know that they shut down nuclear weapons sometimes when they're flying over them. Is this intentional or not? That's not known. I would argue it's not clear that it's intentional. Excuse me, because when Robert Salas gave his accounts, I think it was Robert Salas, but it was in the press conference with Robert Hastings' press conference from 2010. In one of the interviews, they said that the reasons that they found that the missiles were shut down was a guidance and navigation failure. So the navigation system on the missile shut down, and then the computer shut it down because the missile doesn't know where it is and clearly isn't going to be able to hit it. You can't go from not knowing where you are and then hitting a target. So the computer systems then shut the missiles down because of the guidance and navigation systems failure. Now, how could you get a guidance and navigation systems failure? Well, that could happen if you had somebody flying over the missiles and using a warp bubble that's warping space and time. And if their crafts basically manipulate space and time, then then you're necessarily manipulating space and time in some area, and you could very well be messing with space and time in the vicinity of the missile, and 100 feet of ground isn't going to make a difference with that. And the missile navigation system then realizes that it's failed because it has no idea what's going on, and the computer shuts down the missile. So I can come up with a hypothesis where it's an accident. Um, so we
Yeah,
really don't know what the situation is again.
yeah. Are there any historical reports that could provide clues to their nature that you're aware of?
What aspect of their nature, or
Of UFOs in general. However, let me clarify. We are now using the term UFO. I don't think that someone 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago would use the same terminology, because I think it was invented rather recently. With recently, I mean like within the last like 100 years or so. But are there any like historical, maybe religious, mystical, or simply fact based reports um, that you know of that you feel like could be interpreted as accounting for what we would today say is a UFO or something along those lines?
Right, that's an excellent question. There's a lovely book, I think it's called Wonders of the Sky by Chris Aubeck and Jacques Vallée, and they recount um, what appear to be UFO sightings that go back quite a ways, hundreds of years ago. Um, I mean, you have the Indian stories of aerial battles. Those are in Indian mythology. There are Roman historical accounts of flying shields, and in one account there was a battle that was going on in a valley, and the and three flying shields came and flew over and swooped down low and flew over the battlefield while the battle was going on. Scared the bejesus out of everybody. The battle stopped and everybody just took off running. It actually ended the battle, and that's a Roman account. So we know that these things have been here a long time. They've been here throughout human history. Um, there's a woodcut in is it in Germany or Switzerland of an aerial battle. I think it was Switzerland from the 1500s. So there are older accounts, and they are not dissimilar from modern accounts. So that's where it gets quite interesting. I don't think that it enlightens us too much about their nature, but but it does illustrate that they've been here for a long time. And I think
Yeah.
we're just becoming aware. I think we really just became aware of them as a society during World War II.
And that would probably be due to our technical advancements, I'm assuming.
Yeah, we by the time you got to, I mean, a lot happened technologically for us in the last century. We learned how to fly, and we took flight to the battlefield. So you've got the Foo Fighters following our planes in World War II, and and that was a global war. And so, of course, if you are also living on this planet, you're going to be concerned about what are these humans doing this time? What are we doing now? Um, we seem to love to, we're very good at killing each other. We put a lot of energy into it, a lot of thought, and a lot of creativity into it, as the last few days have shown. Um, if only we were that good about helping each other, we would be an awesome species. But sadly, we're not, and I think that's a problem.
Beauti- Beautifully put. Really, really, I mean it. I'm gonna write it down and hang it up somewhere. I really mean it. Like, yeah. um,
I sometimes
how?
wonder about that. I mean, what if you took 10% of the USA's military budget and used it to help people around the world? That would be $40 billion just for 1 year. 10%. How much good would that do, and how much goodwill would that bring us, and how many problems would that solve? I mean, that would be money well spent if it solved any problem, right? Um, but we no, you can't use money to help people, because then why don't I get anything? That always comes up. Why do they get something and I don't? And it all falls apart. Well, that's because we're selfish. That's the problem. We only care
Well,
about ourselves, and that doesn't work. It doesn't work in a society, and we're too societal. So we have to figure this out.
I like your perspective, and of course, I fully agree with you. How might our cultural and psychological uh, biases shape our interpretation of UFOs?
Well, I think that they are already, and we see that already with the United States' military involvement. Who knows about UFOs? It's Pentagon. What is the Pentagon for? War. We are worried about threats. We see them as a threat already, and I don't think that's I don't think that's correct, and I don't think that's the image that's really that we try to portray. But I think that that underlying, because we humans are all threats to each other. I think that's our natural go-to. You see somebody else, well, they might be a threat. Um, I mean, heck, immigrants from Mexico are considered a threat. That's it. We're nuts. We're really superstitious and nuts that way.
Yeah.
Sometime we get at some point we got to pull it together and get past this. But and I don't know when that will be or how that's going to work. But
Yeah. What's your take on crop circles?
oh wow, that's a good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before. Excellent. We know that a number of crop circles were made by people. We know this as hoaxes. So like most, and we know that a lot of UFO sightings are hoaxes, right? And so we know, so the, in physics we call that a low signal to noise ratio. There's a lot of noise, a lot of garbage you got to wade through to get to the interesting bits. And I think for the most of my career, I've still thought that crop circles were just hoaxes by people and nonsensical. However, recently I've learned that crop circles are very old, that they, again, like UFO sightings, go back hundreds of years. So that's interesting. Is it possible that some crop circles are related to UFOs? May possibly, or are they another phenomenon that's possible? Is it possible that clearly some of them are human made, a lot of them are human made and not interesting, but to what degree are some of them interesting? I don't know. That would be interesting to find out, but that's a whole other area of study, and that's difficult to do.
Yeah. You mentioned the CIA previously. Who do you think has currently the most information on UFOs?
That's a good question. I don't know, and I'm not sure anybody does. We do know how these secret government programs work. They are highly compartmentalized so that you have a handful of people working on one aspect of the problem, and that's all that they get to see. And then another aspect of the problem is being handled by another handful of people, and they don't communicate with each other. Who they communicate to, it's not known. And I'm and we also know that, from my experience as a scientist, that you don't get very far working in groups of 3 or 4 people on a single problem. It's really a community of scientists that make progress, and that's what's been not happening for 80 years. So I suspect we really don't know much about UFOs, and that's really the fault of the military and the U.S. military keeping this stuff secret, and other countries keeping it secret. And if they ever fret about the fact that they don't know what they need to know, well, then they need to get their act together and get scientists involved around the world, working together, trying to figure this out openly. And that's the way you solve problems. If this is really an important problem, let's do that. Let's get to work and do that. So now at this point, some scientists are involved. I'm involved with UAPx, and I have affiliations with several other organizations, and we have other organizations around the world, the Galileo Project, SUAPs, the SCU, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. You have the Sol Foundation. You have IFEX in Germany. You have VASCO in Sweden. And we're all in communication with each other, trying to figure this out ourselves. There is no funding, no federal funding in the US for this yet. And if they want scientists to actually study it, that would be a wise thing to do. But some of us are now working on it, and we're working together globally to try to get to the bottom of it. But I really think that our governments, and I'll use plural because there are multiple countries involved, really don't know very much about these things. A lot of the because it's kept secret, a lot of the leaders aren't aware of how serious the topic is. Um, Again, using the word serious, it implies threat, right? Which we're back to that again, which is a constant problem. It's not clear there's a threat, but it's clear that we have somebody else we share this planet with that we don't know anything about. It would be smart for us to know,
Yeah.
at the very least.
Are you in favor for full disclosure, or would you rather argue for more cautious and controlled release of information?
Disclosure is going to be a mess. When it really happens, it's going to be a mess. So far, you've seen we're in the disclosure process now. We've had disclosures, and people who have been paying attention realize that, oh, this is a real situation, and they have come to terms with it to some degree. I think most of the world hasn't been paying attention. Nobody has the bandwidth for this anymore, and there's too much other serious things happening in the world. And so this very abstract thing that we've been told our whole lives is nonsense turns out to be true. That's going to be hard for people to get their heads around. And I think there's an excellent talk by Chris Mellon, the Soul Foundation meeting from last year, from November 2023. And you can find that on YouTube. And he talks about the situation. And he, at one point, likened it to COVID. And what went wrong with COVID was that a lot of little aspects of society faltered. Right, several things happened in our society that didn't work, and they had all happened at once, and we couldn't easily recover from that. And that's what made COVID really difficult. And that's going to be the same thing for this type of disclosure. It's going to hit the stock market because people are going to panic. It's going to hit churches and religion because there's going to be some panic and concern there. It's going to hit schools in some degree. How do schools handle this? And so, these are just a few off the top of my head, but people have looked at this more carefully and can give you more details. But I think disclosure will be a mess. Should you not do it? No, we have to do it. I mean, people should know what the situation is. And that's especially true if it turns out that the abduction phenomenon is real. And that's, again, another phenomenon that's related to UFOs. Even UFO people don't like to talk about the abduction phenomenon because it's that taboo. But if it turns out that that's a real phenomenon and really happens, at some point we need to worry about that. What's going on here? That means people are being taken by somebody and having experiments done on them. Should that not be a matter of concern for our governments? I would think so. Should people know that it happens? I would think so. How much do you want people to know? Right away? Maybe not a whole lot right away. So I think it's going to take some time to let disclosure happen. And,
Yeah.
conveniently, since the 1940s, we've had a growth of science fiction that I think has warmed people up to the idea of others, especially in the extraterrestrial sense. Am I suggesting that was planned? No, I think it happened. I think it's convenient for us because I think it will make disclosure a bit easier than it would have been in 1947 or in the 1940s when you had Foo Fighters. I think disclosure then would have been a nightmare. So I think we're in a better position to have disclosure now. People are so used to science fiction being real in some sense that when I teach an astronomy class, I had on one of my final exams, I just had what bodies in the solar system have people set foot on. That was one of my softball questions on a final exam in an astronomy class, and the answer is Earth and Moon. But I've had people put down Tatooine. So they they don't really know that Luke Skywalker's homeworld is not a real place. I mean, so and I think this is how science fiction has warmed some of us up to this idea, and that's convenient.
Yeah. There
Some care
are,
needs to be. I think that there is care being taken. At some point, we need to see real evidence. As a scientist, I want to see real evidence. It is, I believe what that David Grush is telling the truth when he talks about crash craft and bodies. I've heard this from numerous people, and as have others. But we need evidence. I'm a scientist. I want to see evidence. We need evidence of this. We've also heard that Roswell was Project Mogul. We have evidence that it wasn't, and there's no way it could have been. And when you look at the logs of the the principal investigator who was at NYU who ran Project Mogul, you look at his logs. They did not have a balloon launch that month, so there's no way it was one of those balloons. And if you were going to have the Pentagon tell us that it was a governmental project, I want to see evidence of this. Where's the requisition for all the troops that were sent to Roswell? What were they sent there for? Where are those papers? Present that paperwork. Show us what they were there for. Of course, they don't do that, which is suspicious. And the Pentagon and the Air Force has been telling us story after story for 80 years about what happened at Roswell. The first story, of course, was the one that they put in the newspaper, that the Army Air Force put in the newspaper, saying that they captured a disc. That was the first story. The next story was the next day. That story was quashed, and there was a weather balloon, and that was the next day. And then 1992, the Air Force says that they were testing Mars landers, and the back shell, the saucer-shaped back shell of the lander was mistaken for a disk. Well, wait a minute. Who's testing Mars landers in 1947, 10 years before we had a satellite? 10 years before we knew we could travel in space, they were testing Mars landers? That's BS. Again, lied to. So I want to see evidence. Where's the paperwork for that lander? Present it. So I want to see evidence on both sides. Anybody making any claims about what the government has or has done with UFOs, there is evidence. Present it. Let's be honest about things for once.
you would like to see evidence, but given the enormous consequences of undeniable evidence, can you understand why you, up until this point, had not have access to this kind of evidence?
I can understand to some degree, but our leaders ought to know that this is what the situation is. The president ought to know. Why is the president not able to be informed about this? Who is running the government becomes the question, right? Who's making this decision? If it's not the elected officials making the decision to disclose or not disclose, then this isn't a democracy. And then we have a bigger problem. And that's serious.
Yeah,
And that's true
I
for
think,
many of the other countries involved too. That's true for the UK, it's true for Europe, it's true for South American countries. It's a big problem. We're looking at
yeah.
a real problem here, and it's very concerning.
There are people coming forward from within the government that are making claims that would suggest that significant progress has been made when it comes to understanding and applying the technology from UFOs. What are your thoughts on that, on the progress?
That is, of course it's possible. It's hard to imagine that they've made such progress without having crash craft. So those two kind of have to go hand in hand. And if they've made scientific progress on this, then let the rest of the world of science know. This is what scientists do. Scientists share information. We always share information. We share information. We test each other's hypotheses. We reperform each other's experiments. This is how science works. And if you've got government scientists doing this and they're not doing this, they're not scientists. They're something else. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
I don't know what they really have found. I've talked to some of those people, and I've and have some ideas, but of course, they're not allowed to talk about it, and for the most part, they don't.
You said you talked to some of those people. Can you elaborate on which kind of companies they
Well,
were working for?
there are some people who are more public. I mean, Erik Davis from the Davis Wilson memo, and so these people have done research on warp drives and things like this, and some of that's been made public from the ATIP program, and so we know some of the things that have been worked on, and there are some of those white papers were made public, and so we have some idea of what progress was made. Can they elaborate? No, and they don't, and that's to be expected. But
You once mentioned in a previous podcast, and please forgive me if I misrepresent something or put something out of context, that disclosing UFOs wouldn't be too disruptive. So you speculated that they might be hiding something bigger. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that might be?
yeah, I think well, there's many aspects of this that are possible. One, I've already mentioned the abduction phenomenon. If that really happens, and they are performing experiments with people, some of the suggested activities seem to include breeding humans. They take eggs and sperm from people, and they have give them babies to hold. All sorts of very strange stories. And if that's actually happening, that is disconcerting, and certainly would be terrifying to learn about in 1947, and still might be terrifying depending on what's going on. So I think that's a real possibility that they're hiding something that is more worrisome than just aliens present on Earth, or extraterrestrials, or I mean somebody else present on Earth, whoever they are, non-humans. Could there be, if any of the paranormal effects turn out to be real, that could be very worrisome in some cases. If if we go back to, I mean, I'm just going to use Roswell as an example. I mean, if that was really a disk crash and disk recovery, their response was hyperbolic. Whatever happened in Roswell, the military's response was hyperbolic. That's not debatable. They overreact. They reacted very severely. They detained the sheriff for days. The sheriff was detained and questioned for days. What right does the military have to just show up and detain a sheriff? That doesn't happen in America, and it did in Roswell. So something scared them badly, badly enough to do things that are un-American and illegal. There were illegal activities done by by the military in taking people, threatening their lives if they talk, all of these things. If any of that happened, which there's plenty of evidence that it did, that's illegal, and that's a problem. And were the militaries really that worried about Project Mogul? Really? Are you kidding me? Do you know what Project Mogul was? They were trying to figure out what altitude it would be best to try to record sound waves coming from a nuclear blast. And they were trying to figure out how to keep a hot air balloon hovering at a certain altitude. What happens with a hot air balloon? You put hot air in it, it goes up and expands and goes up faster and faster and faster and expands, and it blows up and the thing falls. And they couldn't maintain altitude. And Project Mogul was designed to try to hold balloons at about 50,000 feet. That's all Project Mogul was. That's it. You're going to detain a sheriff for 5 days for that? No. There's something else happened at Roswell. And I don't want to just make this about Roswell. I think the whole thing is, I think something about this has scared somebody badly, and that in some way has led to this kind of secrecy. Um, could it be just the level of technology that they encountered? It could be. Um, Having the technology that allows you to get from one side of the planet to the other in a minute would be devastating in the hands of anyone on this planet. I mean, looking at our destructive capabilities and desires, um, and UFOs travel that fast. You can get from here to London in 10 minutes. You can't prepare for a nuclear attack in that period of time. You wouldn't detect the craft fast enough. So now you can't even prepare to retaliate for a nuclear attack. So that changes the whole game. Could that be enough to scare them? It could. That's possible. You don't want anybody else having this technology. We very quickly take our technologies and make them destructive. And if they encountered some pretty amazing technology, that would be a problem for us. We humans couldn't handle it, and that could be enough to scare them as well. So I think there's many things that somebody could have been scared about, and I think that that's probably what happened. Something really worried someone um, in power, and they hushed this up quickly and harshly.
Yeah. There are speculations on that significant progress in fundamental science has been made long ago, like 60s, 70s, 80s. Do you believe that is possible?
Oh, that it came from UFO technology?
No, sorry, let me specify that question. That
Yeah, sure.
significant progress has been made in science that has not been shared with the public.
I mean, it's certainly possible that they made some progress in something and didn't share it. I mean, that happens all the time, and especially with secret research, but or classified research. But how significant it was is a real question, and to what degree do they understand it is really in question. It usually takes to understand new theory, say, the theory of superconductivity with Cooper pairs in the 1960s. To understand that well, we're still trying to understand it well. So, how well they, to making a breakthrough or an advancement isn't always the desired outcome. Uh, do you really know what you're doing is the question. And I'm willing to bet that, yeah, they may have made some discoveries and came to understand some things, but do they really know what they're doing? Probably not. You need a scientific community to do that.
Diana Pasulka mentioned that some scientists report some sort of downloads from of inspiration from external sources. What's your view on that, and how do you find your inspiration?
Right. That's a good question. Or two questions at least. I'm aware of the download phenomena. I've heard this from multiple people. I know of at least four people who have experienced this and who've described it to me. Um, I don't disbelieve them. One person I know had knowledge about quantum field theory downloaded into their head, and they had not taken physics courses. And I was learned that after I was talking to them about we were discussing quantum field theory, and they were able to maintain the discussion. So I asked them, what university did you get your degree from? They said, no, I never took physics. And I said, how do you know anything about quantum field theory? and they explained that they had an encounter and they had that information downloaded to them. Um, yeah, can I disbelieve them? I could just easily disbelieve them. I know that they understand some aspects of quantum field theory pretty well, so I have evidence of that. Yeah, so are they lying that they didn't actually get a PhD and they're pretending they didn't? That's hard to believe, but um, Yeah. So these phenomena are strange, and I've heard about this as well. How do I get my inspirations? I think this is true of a lot of scientists and mathematicians. Is that it just they come to you? It's an inspiration. It just pops into your head, and it is strange. They don't feel in all cases, and I'm not saying that I've experienced downloads because I don't believe I have, especially as they've been described to me. But in all cases, when a new idea comes to you like that, it just pops into your head, and it doesn't feel like it's your idea. It feels like it was given to you. And so I joke sometimes that a lot of my inspirations come or ideas come when I'm taking my shower in the morning. So I get up and I get in the shower, and I'm in the shower, and an idea pops into my head. And I usually have an interesting idea every day, every time I shower. And so but it's not always a good idea. Sometimes they're just kind of wacky. So I joke that it's my muse. My muse gives me these ideas when I'm in the shower, but sometimes she's a little drunk. She's drunk from the night before. So my drunken muse has given me a really weird idea today. So I joke with myself about that. Um,
Well,
but that's how I experience it.
well, maybe you should take more showers then.
I should
No,
maybe
but
shower more often. That's actually a good point. I had a computer program came to me in a dream once, which was interesting. It was way back. I had a Commodore 64, and this was back in the 80s when the new Macintoshes came out. And my friend had a Macintosh, and she had the drawing program where you could draw something and then click in the middle and fill it in. And I wanted to do that on my drawing programs, and I didn't have that. My program that I used on the Commodore 64 couldn't do that. So I wanted to write my own code to do that. So I started I'd been working for 2 days trying to get the code to work. And it always failed at some cases. If I made something too curved, it would fill it in partway and then stop. And I always had problems with this, and I was a little frustrated. So one night I went to sleep after working on this, and I had a dream that I was touring a news station, and we were visiting with the weatherman, and the weatherman was at the computer, and he was drawing clouds and then clicked in the middle and filled them in. And I said, how does that work? I've been trying to figure out how to program this and get it to work, and I would keep getting stuck on little aspects of it. And he goes, oh, it's very easy. You do this and this and this and this. And he basically described the algorithm for me. And I thanked him and walked away, and then just woke up in a start. And then I thought, oh, that might actually work. And I ran to my computer, got up out of bed, went to my computer, quick wrote it down on paper, and then I programmed it into my computer, and it worked the first time. And rarely does a program work the first time when you when you write a program. It worked right the first time and solved all the problems, and that came in a dream. So how
well,
does this work? I don't know. My brain is working on this in the background and then informed me through the dream, perhaps. That would be a conventional explanation, but yeah, it's still weird.
are because Diana Pasulka and some other people are hinting at that there are certain rituals that one can do in order to receive those kind of downloads. Now, given that you're a scientist and that obviously making a breakthrough would probably be your aim, do you know at all about what kind of rituals she was hinting at?
No, I don't. That's an interesting question. I should talk to her and find out what the rituals are and try some.
And get back to
But
me, please.
get downloads. I don't know if I want downloads. They sound really distracting and
Yeah,
disorienting, but maybe
yeah.
that's a good idea. I don't know.
I really appreciate you taking your time. I know you're a busy man, so I'm immensely grateful.